Hey guys, Miss Kanata here, just going through what we've learned about so far in Unit 2 on proportional relationships. So the first thing we have is the definition of a proportional relationship, and that states that if the ratios between two corresponding quantities are always equivalent, then the relationship between them is called a proportional relationship. And one way to tell if the ratios are equivalent is by multiplying a number on the left by a certain number to get the other row and making sure that the same number applies to the column on the right. So if we look here, we have 1 times 2 is 2, 3 times 2 is 6, so we're good here. We can go from 1 to 5, and we know that 1 times 5 is 5, and 3 times 5 is 15. And then the last thing we can do is we know that 1 times 10 is 10, and 3 times 10 is 30. So this is a proportional relationship. And then if we look at the table on the right, we know that 3 times 2 is 6, but 6 times 1.5 is 9. So already we know that we're not dealing with equivalent ratios here, so this table is not proportional. Another way that we have been looking at proportional relationships is in tables. To see if a table represents a proportional relationship, we want to see if there is a certain number that we can multiply every row by on the left to get its corresponding row on the right side of the table. And this number that we multiply by is called the constant of proportionality, or we also just shorten that with being the COP. So if we look at the first table, we know that 1 times 3 is 3, and I just want to make sure I can do that to everything else in the rest of the table. 2 times 3 is in fact 6, 5 times 3 is 15, and 10 times 3 is 30. So that tells us that the COP here is 3. And then in the second table, we want to go from 4 to 2. Now I know that 4 divided by 2 is 2, but again, the definition says that there is some number that you can multiply by the number in the first column, and dividing by 2 is the same as multiplying by a half. So 4 times 1/2 is 2, 1 times 1/2 is a half, 10 times a half is 5, and 20 times a half is 10. So the COP here is 1/2. After we looked at tables, we started to go in the next step, which is writing equations. So after we fill out a table of proportional relationships, or with a proportional relationship, we can then use that information to write equations. And the general equation for a proportional relationship is y equals kx, or y equals k times x. And that in that equation, k is the COP. And in this table on the right, I made a little mistake. This should be centimeters. So if we look at this first table on the left, we're going to say that the length in centimeters is x and the length in millimeters is y. And we know that in 1 centimeter there is 10 millimeters. So we know that 1 times 10 is 10. So I want to do the same thing with the rest of this table. I want to multiply everything on the left by 10 to get my answers in the right side of the table. And I know that 2 times 10 is 20, 5 times 10 is 50, 10 times 10 is 100. And then for the last row, we have the letter x. And that's just saying for any length in centimeters, could be 5, it could be 20, it could be 30. To get the length in millimeters, we just multiply it by 10. So the last row would be x times 10, or just 10x. And then we have our COP is 10, and the COP means there are 10 millimeters in 1 centimeter. So now I have to write my equation, and I want to think about what I was trying to look for in the problem. And in this case, I was trying to calculate the length in millimeters every time. So to get the length in millimeters, to get my y, I was doing 10 times my length in centimeters. And to write out 10 times my length in centimeters, I have 10x. So my equation is y equals 10x. I'm going to do the same thing for the table on the right, where I have my length in millimeters is y and my length in centimeters is x. And I want to think about, what do I multiply 10 by to get 1? That number is 1/10, which is my COP. And I want to do the same thing with everything on the left side to get the answer on the right side. So 1 times 1/10 is 1/10. 50 times 1/10 is 5. And then 2 times 1/10 is 2/10. For any length in millimeters, to get that answer in centimeters, I would do y times 1/10. I would take that length in millimeters and multiply it by 1/10. So my last row is y times 1/10, or 1/10 y. And then the COP here tells me that there is 1/10 of a centimeter in 1 millimeter. And if you look here at our COPs, we have a COP of 10 and a COP of 1/10, and these are reciprocals. So when we have two tables that are looking at the same information, one COP will be a whole number and the other COP will be the reciprocal of that. And my equation is actually going to also be reciprocals of the equation on the left. So in this case, I am looking for my length in centimeters, so I'm looking for my x, and to get my x every single time, I'm taking my y and multiplying it by 1/10. So I have x equals 1/10 y. So if you see here, these two equations are also reciprocals.